Just about everyone who is fascinated by pirates has dreamt of being a pirate captain. Whether it was when running around with wooden swords at the beach, or when booting up Sid Meier's pirates after watching the adventures of Captain Jack Sparrow. It is an appealing fantasy to be in command of your own ship and crew, to do whatever you please, to go wherever you want. Whenever you go aboard your ship in the game Assassin's Creed 4, your crew pump their fists and cheer for you, as if your mere existence warrants celebration. These fantasies, being a means of escape from responsibilities like going to school, work, cleaning your room or taking out the trash, omits the responsibilities that a pirate captain had. A leader has to ensure the surviving and thriving of his flock, to ensure his own survival. The problem with being a pirate captain was that you were surrounded by pirates, and if you did not make them happy, they'd be more than glad to tell you, or worse. The life of a pirate captain was always on the knife's edge, but for those individuals with the ability, brutality, and charisma, it could win them untold fame and fortune. The obvious first question is, how did you become a captain of pirates? On this channel I seldom make a distinction between pirates and privateers, because our conception of these practices is the opposite of the period, where the distinction was ambiguous in the first place. These men were always walking a thin line between the two, which is why I tend to bunch them into one for the sake of simplicity. A lot of pirate captains began as privateers. In this case, a group of wealthy investors, the likes of merchants, landowners, and aristocrats, would buy a ship and hire a captain based on his reputation. They would then acquire a privateering commission for him. After being hired, the privateer captain was usually left to his own devices to hire a crew. A pirate or privateer could also become a captain if they owned the ship themselves. It was very common on the island of Bermuda for the local landholders to construct their own sloops. They were both owners, masters, and captains of these vessels. Bermudian landholders became renowned privateers during the War of Spanish Succession, and then pirates. The most famous example is Henry Jennings, one of the leading figures in the Nassau Flying Gang, nowadays called the Pirate Republic. Another more unorthodox example is Stede Bonnet. He used his wealth as a landowner to purchase and refit a sloop for privateering. Though he was the captain, he preferred the title of Major, which was his rank in the Barbadian militia. Indeed, not every pirate commander was called captain. If a pirate commanded a fleet of ships, he was usually titled Commodore. This was the rank of the aforementioned Henry Jennings. In the previous century, the buccaneers preferred the title of Admiral, likely because many of them had pirated under actual admirals like Henry Morgan or Vice Admiral Christopher Minks. A popular slang word for the title was Ambral. Logically then, you could become a pirate captain by being appointed as captain of a ship by your admiral. The buccaneers called them Vice Admiral. Some of these Vice Admirals could even desert the fleet, go off on their own, or even part from the fleet by accident, such as a storm or fog. Judging by a few journals, buccaneers appear also to have used the title of Commander, and when marching on land, he was titled General. One of Henry Morgan's old soldiers was a buccaneer named Charles Swan. He seems to have invested his money rather well, because by the 1680s, he had become a merchant captain in possession of his own ship, the Signet. However, during a disastrous voyage to South America, Swan was forced into piracy by his crew. They respected his ownership of the vessel, and due to his ability and surprising charisma, kept him as captain. If you'd like to learn more about this fascinating and frankly hilarious individual, I highly suggest my video on him. It is in fact my personal favorite. Anyway, if the pirates didn't inherit a captain from a previous line of work, like privateering or trading, they would have to democratically elect a captain. A captain was elected if a group of pirates banded together and stole a vessel, if the previous captain had died, or was democratically deposed. After a successful mutiny, it was very common for the ringleader to be elected captain. In many cases, he was a ship's officer, like a gunner, bosun, or first mate. The captain was chosen based on his abilities as a fighter, sailor, and leader. But I have found little documentation on how these elections occurred, and if there was any ceremony attached to them. Potential candidates would present themselves, possibly giving a short speech as to why they were the most able. The voting might then occur in turns for each candidate, with the crewmen raising their hands. such a procedure can easily be manipulated by peer pressure, so it is possible that they voted by using some sort of ballots. You could just take a hat and put pieces of paper in it. Historian Benison Little wrote the following in his book, The Sea Rover's Practice. Among pirates, buccaneers, and filibusters, worst was the democratic process of electing commanders, a process often subverted or manipulated, though he did not provide any examples or sources to this statement. It was rare for the choice to be contested, but there are a few incidents of controversial pirates being elected and almost causing violent mutiny. More diplomatic crewmen would intervene to calm both sides. If the feelings didn't fade, the company would split up. I've never heard of any candidates dueling for control over a company. That seems to largely be an invention of Howard Pyle and his famous painting, Who Shall Be Captain? When the captain had been chosen, he might give a short speech to inspire his new company. He would then choose his lieutenants, which were his closest deputies. A quartermaster was elected by the crew to represent their interests. He essentially served as a counterbalance to the captain. If the crew didn't have any articles of agreement, the captain would write one together with the crew and sign it under his name. With the captain elected, he could get right to work, and his duties were manifold. He was responsible for making ultimate decisions, for running the ship, and representing the crew as their face to the public. Most importantly, he led the pirates in battle. As the crew's representative, the captain was responsible for negotiating with external parties. Recruits, prisoners, and visitors were brought before his scrutiny. He attended meetings concerning trade, parley, or prisoner exchange. Many such negotiations were done through writing, for example, negotiating for pardons. Even though pirates made important decisions democratically, documents were usually just signed by the captain, sometimes by the officers of his council. We can imagine that a lot of letters were written collectively. On the average day, the captain could be found on the quarterdeck, a raised platform in the hind part of the ship. From here he could oversee the entire vessel, the crew, and its managing. The task of running the ship varied in difficulty depending on how many officers he had under him. A sailing master was necessary for charting a course and navigating. Bosuns knew the rigging, quartermasters and lieutenants were assigned to manage smaller work groups. In truth, we know little about the captain's monotonous day-to-day. We can search for clues in sea manuals written for the Navy and Merchant Marine. In these, the duties of the captain include, but are not limited to, keeping accounts of expenses and the ship's stores, something pirates likely relegated to the quartermaster. Keeping a muster book of all crewmen, and being present at all musters. We don't know if pirates kept muster books, only that they signed their articles of agreement. Keeping a list of deserters. The buccaneers allowed their crewmen to leave whenever they wanted, but later pirates were more strict and punished deserters, so they very likely did this. Keeping a regular journal, containing what ships they encountered, how these interactions were managed, if someone died, what ports they entered, etc. Some buccaneer captains kept journals, and allegedly some pirates. We don't have any surviving examples. If the pirates had one, they would destroy it, as it was evidence of their crimes. Privateer captains kept journals, and if they engaged in more shady activities, might modify these events in writing. Organizing the work groups. Responsibility for the conduct and governing of the ship, and due execution of all regulations. Pirates, of course, had their own set of regulations. These are some of the written rules which pirate captains may have inherited on the account. Judging by journals and eyewitness accounts, we can ascertain some other duties or dilemmas he might encounter in the day-to-day. He would intervene in everyday disputes, and if morale was bad, he might have to rouse the company with a speech or even a good beatdown. If the crew consisted of different factions, political opinions, religions, and nationalities, he would have to find a way to keep them appeased. There was a lot of decision making. Do we need to repair the ship? Where should we do it? How long should we stay in port? A lot of decisions were made democratically, through General Council with the voting crewmen. These decisions could concern anything. Pirates would vote on important things as where they would sail, if they would attack a ship or not, how an offender ought to be punished, or if certain passengers should be allowed aboard. Only pirates who had signed the articles were allowed to vote, and the captain had 2 votes, effectively making him a tiebreaker. The duties of the captain would have depended on his level of authority. Aboard a pirate ship, there were essentially 3 levels of government. The highest office was the captain. Below him were his council of officers. What officers this council consisted of varied. On paper, the quartermaster was the second in command, but in a lot of cases we find the sailing master as the captain's deputy. In a few cases, the surgeon. Whichever men were the most useful, intelligent, and experienced could find themselves as close advisors to the captain. Below the council was the crew. Having signed the articles, they were permitted to carry their own weaponry and expected to have a vote in all affairs. But the more authority a captain had, the more power he could exercise without consulting his council or the crew. Conversely, a captain with low authority would have been left almost entirely in the hands of the democratic process. Most pirates and privateers found themselves somewhere in the middle, and there is no clear pattern in what decided the captain's authority. It depended on the group dynamics and personalities involved, and their backgrounds. But here are some important factors in deciding the captain's authority. The time period. During the 17th century, the buccaneers were very democratic and despised tyrannical leadership. Simultaneously, the buccaneers respected commissions. If they joined up with a commissioned officer, such as Henry Morgan, they would not contest his position. Relevant to the point above is the background of the captain and the crew. For example, Richard Taylor was a former naval officer. He ran his pirate company with an iron fist. In the 18th century, pirates became more tyrannical. Many of their captains assumed dictatorial authority, unlike their buccaneer progenitors. Richard Taylor is a prime example, but Bartholomew Roberts is another. Violence. There are cases of pirate captains simply using their physical prowess and threats of violence to keep their company obedient. Captain Kidd ran his crew like an autocrat, and when anyone spoke to his contrary, he threatened them. John Taylor would physically descend upon his mutinous crewmen and beat them up. But most importantly was the captain's ability. If he could keep the company happy, he could get away with pretty much anything. It wasn't just about gold and glory. He also had to keep them well fed, clothed, entertained, and drunk. The ship had to be kept in top trim and the crew exercised. Most of the produce plundered by the pirates of the late Golden Age were life necessities. And if the captain could keep his men content, he could reap the benefits of his office. We always envision our pirate captain as living an extravagant lifestyle, compared to the squalor of his filthy crew. The most obvious luxury might be some semblance of privacy. While the crew had to eat and sleep together, the captain could have his own cabin, all to himself, however small it might be. This cabin could be furnished with walls painted with a nice cloudy scenery, fine furniture like chairs, pillows, and a desk for writing his journal. Whilst the crew slept on the naked deck or in hammocks between the cannons, he could sleep in a cradle, a sheltered bed. He had windows for looking out at the sea, and maybe even his private toilet, a seat with a hole leading straight to the water. Some captains established elaborate ceremonies for audiences to their quarters. Aboard the ship of the terrible Edward Lowe, prisoners were first met by the gunner, who directed them to the cabin, outside of which he introduced them to Lowe. Lowe then invited them to sit inside in one of his many chairs, and afterwards rang a bell, summoning a servant to make a bowl of punch. However, other companies scorned such ceremonies. Bartholomew Roberts was a pirate who always lived on the knife's edge. He stayed in the crew's good grace thanks to his success and ruthlessness, allowing him to often make autocratic decisions, often arbitrary. The crew offered him many gifts, including his own cabin, but they were still permitted to enter as they pleased, to curse at him, use his chinaware, and enjoy his food and drink. Many pirates went the extra mile. They butchered their ships to the waterline, cutting down the raised sections, cabins, and internal partitions. Some have argued that this was a social statement, to make the captain and officers equal to the crew. Indeed, it forced them to share the company's conditions, sleeping on the naked deck without a table to eat at or chair to sit in. However, period sources attribute this to effectivizing the ship for combat. By cutting away unnecessary sections, the ship became lighter and speedier. By permanently removing furniture and partitions, they would not have to do it before combat, thus putting them in a state of perpetual readiness. Neither did the captain necessarily have better clothes than what we normally imagine. There was nothing preventing any of the pirates from wearing whatever they desired. The captain had the same means of acquiring clothes as his crew. In one incident, Captains Coughlin, Davis, and Levasseur seized a chest of fine coats, intending to keep them for themselves to impress African ladies. Their quartermasters seized the garments, saying that it went against pirate custom. The coats, along with all stolen clothing and private items, had to be put on auction for any pirate to purchase with his own money. We know that all pirates had a taste for fancy clothing, so they would have had a few coats, feathered hats, and high-heeled shoes lying in their sea chest. But they preferred to wear what the situation required. Sailing? Sailors' clothes. Campaigning on land? Soldiers' clothes. Partying in Port Royal? Gentlemen's clothes. No pirate would have looked just one way. Like every other person, they would have had a large and complicated wardrobe, and mixed their wear with whatever was available, when the situation required. The pirate captain was no different. We do have one eyewitness illustration of a filibuster captain and some of his associates. And as we can see, he doesn't look radically different from them. It also seems he pioneered the dab. Of course, historians like Angus Constam have speculated that, when at sea, the captain had less menial duties and would be able to wear his fancier garments at all times. Aboard merchant and naval vessels, clothing was used as an indicator of the strict hierarchy, something which usually wasn't as strict aboard a pirate ship. It might even have been socially taboo for a pirate captain to dress different from his associates. Or maybe the opposite, the crew might have expected the captain and officers to look different, since they wanted some form of hierarchy and were often used to it. This is all speculation, and you'll have to make up your own mind. It was more likely for commissioned officers to wear clothing different from their men. Charles Swan dressed in a coat out at sea. George Shelvocke, a privateer in the early 1720s, almost had uniforms employed among his officers. His harshest critic, William Bettay, described them as follows. In a few days after this, all our petty officers and boat's crew appeared in their fine silk waistcoats, caps and breeches. Our commander himself in a silken skin, as the word pudesoy implies, and the bow gentleman his son in a cinnamon-colored suit of fine silk, all wondrously gallant and gay. Shelvocke's suit was later described as being black, with large silver loops down the breast. Bettay described it as ridiculous, perhaps indicating that privateers preferred a more humble-looking captain. Pirate and especially privateer captains might enjoy a different meal from the crew. It was either prepared by the same cook, or the captain and officers might even have their own cook. There are scarce reports of what pirate captains ate specifically. One eyewitness wrote about John Taylor's eating habits, saying that he, often discarding his own prerogatives as captain, by coming down into the 'tween decks to converse, play, eat from the common pot, or drink with them, indicating that he mostly engaged in other activities and ate different food. On the day of his demise, Bart Roberts alleged they had salmagundy, a sort of salad. For privateers, we have more information. Woodes Rogers wrote how he enjoyed a meal of mutton and cabbage. We also know that captains would often keep private stores of preservatives like fruits, sweetmeats, and marmalades, sausage, and cheese. It seems likely that most pirate captains would have enjoyed the same diet as their crewmen, partly because pirates always expected good food, if it was available. If they had the means to do so, they drank hot chocolate, ate fresh fruit and game, and even made pancakes. But if rations were low, the captain would endure it as well. In his journal, William Dick writes, "For provisions at length grew so scarce with us that we were only allowed 5 ounces of meal and 1 pint of water to each man, the captain himself having no more allowance than the rest." But it's always more fun to share your food with someone. Roberts shared his salmagundy salad with a prisoner, and indeed, high-status prisoners like officials, officers, and even other captains were often kept in the captain's company. Very often they were treated decently and invited to fruitful discussions. Bartholomew Sharp wrote how he and Captain Peralta discussed comets. Some captains abhorred the ill treatment of women, and if they were unable to release female prisoners, might grant them refuge from the hands of the crew in their own cabin. Such were the cases with captains like Diego de Mulato and Edward England, who later married and had a child with his former prisoner. Some captains might even risk taking their girlfriend aboard, like John Rackham did with Anne Bonny. Contrary to popular belief, Bonny was never disguised as a man, But we have other incidents where captains did disguise their girlfriends. These captains were not pirates, and it was only for delivering their woman to another location. The most obvious companion would be the officers of the captain's council. If the ship was large enough, they might have their own quarters in front of the captain's. If it was small, they might share it with the captain, and there goes the privacy. Other captains might bring their family members aboard. Privateer Captain George Shelvack brought aboard his son and nephew, making them an officer and a surgeon respectively. Like Ned Lowe, many pirate captains had servants. In a few cases grown men, but most popular was to have young boys. They used them for fetching items, cooking their food, washing their clothes, and lighting their pipes. The buccaneer Captain Edmund Cook was accused of having sodomized his servant. We don't know how common this was among pirates, but even if there wasn't, there was often some dark side to the servitude. White boys were often indentured, and many pirate captains kept Indian, African, or mixed-race boys as slaves. William Dampier wrote how Captain Swan kidnapped such a boy from its mother. Captain Sharp was gifted a mulatto boy by his crew. Some captains might not have preferred human, but rather animal company. In media adaptations, we often see pirate captains accompanied by some sort of animal. Long John Silver has a parrot named Flint, and Barbossa is accompanied by the monkey Jack, both pets named after their master's old captain. Parrots and monkeys were indeed popular pirate pets, as were dogs, cats, and chicken, but regular crewmen seem to have been just as likely to keep pets, so it's a subject I'll reserve for its own eventual video. The only time when pirates shunned their democratic notions was during times of necessity. In particular, battle and the chase preceding it. Some articles decreed that the captain's word was law in times of heat, and that any dissident could be executed on the spot. However, some sources disagree. There are incidents of pirates voting during a chase, if they should continue or retreat. During one exchange between a pirate ship and a merchant, the captain of the former tried to calmly negotiate with the latter, before a rogue pirate suddenly appeared above the gunwale, demanding that the merchant surrender. He was quickly silenced by his comrades. This indicates that some form of chaos was always present, even during the chase. In battles at sea, the captain was supposed to lead the ship from his typical position on the quarterdeck. This was a dangerous position, as he risked being sniped by sharpshooters. Pirates expected their captain to be exceptionally brave. He was to be an icon, leading from the front, and inspiring them to great deeds. Captain Coughlin is an excellent example. Despite being exceptionally short, he was immensely cruel and ferocious. He once went ahead of his ship in a rowboat, attacking a slave trader and taking it with only 12 men, the slaver having 45. The buccaneers were even more insane with their expectations, and as a result had a very high death ratio among their leaders. During the Pacific adventure, 5 buccaneer commanders died. Admiral Sawkins was exceptionally aggressive. At Santa Maria he took an arrow to the head and survived. In a later engagement, he and his vanguard were cornered, butchered. If a pirate captain died during battle, he was supposed to be replaced by his quartermaster, and when the battle ended, an election held. This didn't always work. When Bartholomew Roberts was killed by grape shot, ate a grape, as you might say, his crew were so demoralized that they surrendered shortly after. During the disastrous Battle of Arica, the entire command chain was wiped out. Out of desperation, the crew basically forced Bartholomew Sharp back into captaincy. He had previously been deposed on charges of cowardice, because he wasn't as insanely aggressive as Sawkins. When the pirates were safe, half the crew mutineered and split away from Sharp. Indeed, if a pirate captain could not please his crew, he was sure to face the consequences. In the best of cases, the crew would peacefully vote him out of his office. He might then be allowed to stay in the company as a regular crewman. Others might lock him in the bilboes, send him adrift with his supporters, or even maroon him. Edward England was marooned by his crew on account of him not being cruel enough. But there were no black spots. It's a literary device entirely invented by Robert Louis Stevenson for his novel, Treasure Island. In the worst case, the captain was murdered. Pirate captain of the Mocha, Ralph Stout, was murdered for attempting to run away shortly after he failed to capture the East Indiaman, Dorrell. After a streak of bad luck and retreats from the Royal Navy, Thomas Anstice, his quartermaster, and 3 of their supporters were shot when sleeping in their hammocks. So how could a captain save his skin? If he had been a bad boy and mutinous whispers were in the air, there were ways to avoid them. Some captains preferred the diplomatic route. Captain Sharp caught wind of his compatriots plotting to kill him, so he gave them an extra ration of stolen wine. I mentioned before the ferocity of William Kidd. At one point he even murdered a mutineer with a bucket. In the Force Department, Richard Taylor takes the cake. When the crew dared to whisper mutiny, he'd go down himself and beat them up. However, Taylor could also joke around and be a friend to the crew, and his ability as a commander earned him much respect. Still, he never trusted them. In order to keep the crew busy, he organized their work groups to be as diverse as possible. The multiple languages and cultures make it harder to conspire and easier to fight among themselves. If he possessed a valid commission during wartime and was specifically listed as the captain, the crew would respect it. Otherwise, they risked being arrested for piracy and hanged. But this wasn't a guarantee. William Dampier suffered a mutiny during his disastrous stint as a privateer captain, the mutineers stealing his commission and leaving him for dead in a leaky ship. The same almost happened to George Shelvocke. However, having read Dampier's book, Shelvocke hid his commission. The crew were thus content to keep him captain, after making some changes. One of them was reducing his payment down from 60 shares to a mere 6. Though Shelvocke complained about it in his journal, it was still one hell of a payday. Pirates and buccaneers usually only pay their captain in 2 shares, which is still twice the payment of the regular pirate. Some pirate captains got more, seldom over 6, but there are very few cases where they got only 1, same as the crew. If you're wondering how pirates divided their plunder, I intend to make its own video about it. But basically, you first account for how many shares you have to divide the plunder into. Then you divide the loot according to this number, and then give each member the amount of shares he's allotted. So whilst the pirate captain couldn't haul around the massive hoards we often imagine, if they proved successful, he could still make a decent fortune. Most of them would have slightly more pocket change to buy that fancy coat from the auction before the mast. The most successful captains could eventually take their treasure chest and retire as a plantationer, a merchant, a naval officer, or simply disappear. The details of retirement are for its own video, but to stay on topic, if the captain wanted to get rich, the means to get so could truly be in his hands. If he had the charisma, the bravery, the decisiveness, the diplomacy, the physical prowess, and the sheer brutality to be a pirate captain. And let that suffice for a summary. Huge thanks to my generous channel members and Patreon supporters. In particular, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea Dog, Randall DeVere, Old Man Zed, Krillov, Nick Hooper, and Captain Jake Rumdrinker. If you'd like to hang out with fellow pirate enthusiasts, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!